Hey guys, so yesterday I put up a video showing how I very nearly broke my thumb with my Simucube 2 Ultimate Wheelbase, and that video has got a lot more views and generated a lot more discussion than I thought it would. And I'm happy to report that it is 2 days later now since I recorded that video, and I was able to do a little bit of racing last night without too much drama. Still a little bit tender in this sort of muscly, tendony area between my finger and my thumb, but there's no swelling, no bruising, nothing like that, and I can bend it around, and yeah, it's only mildly painful now, so I'm pretty sure there's no permanent damage. But what I wanted to do in today's video is unpack a couple of things here. So I want to talk a little bit more about exactly what happened in the accident and a couple of things that I could have done to prevent the injury from happening in the first place, despite the nature of that accident being a pretty much perfect storm in terms of how to injure yourself with a direct drive wheelbase. So we'll talk about exactly what happened in that accident and the changes that I could have made. And then I want to go through a couple of other general safety tips around direct drive wheelbases in particular, but sim racing in general as well. There's been quite a few comments on that video from people who were looking at getting a direct drive wheelbase, but have been a little bit put off by what happened to me. You know, concerned about injuries and things like that. Obviously, not wanting to hurt themselves playing video games. So we'll talk about that a little bit today as well. Hopefully, by the end of the video, it will put those people's minds at ease and give you a couple of little safety tips that you can use on your own systems to reduce the risk of hurting yourselves or anybody else that might be using your rig. So let's start off by having a closer look at exactly what happened in the accident. So, as I was saying, this was pretty much a perfect storm in terms of how to injure yourself in a sim racing rig. So rather than it being, and a few people commented on the video that you know, turning down the force feedback would have stopped the injury from happening. But really, what I think people need to understand is that it wasn't the impact with the other car or even the impact with the wall that actually caused the injury. What it was when the other guy hit me, and you can see it here on the screen now, he gave me a very gentle nudge on the inside edge of the rear quarter panel of my car. And what that did was it spun the car around at really high speed. It was right before I hit the braking point. So it spun the car around past 90 degrees very, very quickly. So quickly that I didn't have time to sort of either catch the slide or pull my hands off the wheel. Now, one of the first safety tips that I'm going to give you in just a moment is to train yourself to always take your hands off the wheel when an impact is imminent. So whenever the car is past the point of being able to catch the slide, or whenever you know that you're about to hit something and there's nothing you can do about it, just take your hands off the wheel entirely. But yeah, I didn't even have time to react to what was going on. Literally what happened was I was driving along, the car was suddenly completely sideways, the wheel whipped around on me, and what happened was the wheel turned past the point where my arms crossed over and kept going. And because it happened so quickly, I couldn't get my hands away. So you can see here down in this bottom corner of the screen, my thumb is around like that. And as the wheel keeps turning, it bends and bends and eventually it comes out. But if you don't pull your hands away, what ends up happening is it bends it like that and downwards. And it puts a lot of strain on this ligament here, as well as the bones around it and the muscles and everything as well. And you can actually risk breaking this knuckle here or snapping the bone entirely. Now, my wife Jill actually had a very similar injury, and her hand blew up and got really, really bruised as well. So it was a lot worse than mine. And pretty much the exact same thing. She was actually driving with my Club Sport wheelbase 2.5. So a relatively weak wheelbase compared to a direct drive wheelbase at least. And she hit a wall and didn't let go of the wheel at all, even though I told her to. She just held on, and yeah, same thing. It just ripped it out of her hands. And yeah, she ended up doing herself quite a nasty injury. She wasn't able to drive for about 3 months. And that was actually the reason why we ended up not doing that Nürburgring challenge that we were going to be doing about 1.5 years ago now. We're going to get back into that soon, but that's a subject for another video. But yeah, you do just need to be really, really careful and make sure you pull your hands off the wheel if you're having an imminent impact. But yeah, in that case, it whipped around on me so quickly I couldn't get my hands off the wheel in time. So while, as I said before, it was a bit of a perfect storm in terms of the perfect scenario to create a situation where you're going to injure yourself, there were a couple of things that I could have done to prevent it from happening in the first place. So let's just have a quick look at what exactly those are now. So the first thing that I could have done is reducing my bump stop range, and this would have eliminated the problem entirely. So bump stop range is the amount of movement that's available in the wheel itself before you hit the bump stops or the mechanical stops in the wheel. So you can see there I turned it 900 degrees in either direction, lock to lock, and then I hit a, it's not a mechanical bump stop, it is actually something that's done through the software on the wheelbase itself, on a direct drive wheelbase at least. But you can see there I've got the bump stop there at 900 degrees. So what that means is that the wheel is able to rotate all the way around to that point before it stops. So basically, whatever signal the sim sends it to tell it to do that, it's going to just do it with no regard to safety or anything like that. So whatever the motor is being told to do, it's just going to translate it straight through the wheel into your hands. So what we can do is adjust the bump stop range. So let's just quickly jump into the Simucube software and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so here you can see we've got steering range as well as bump stop range. And these two do operate independently of each other to an extent at least. So the steering range is the range of movement that's available and how it actually translates the sensitivity of what the inputs are that you make relative to the car in the game. So the more sensitive you have this set, the less movement you have to make physically to make a sharper turn in the game. And often if we're driving something like F1 cars, for example, we'll reduce this down to maybe 320 degrees or 360 degrees so that we get slightly sharper movement inside the game. But we can also adjust our bump stop range independently here. Now, when I had that accident, I had my bump stop range set as it is right now at 900 degrees, which, as we saw before, allows the wheel to rotate all the way past the point where your arms cross, and that was the problem. So we're going to adjust this all the way down, just using the arrow keys here, so I've got a slightly more precise adjustment. We're going to adjust that down to about 360 degrees, which should be about the point where my arms cross. So we set it to 360. Now you can see here it hasn't changed the sensitivity at all, the steering range. So the movement that I make relative to the amount of steering force or the steering input in the game has not changed. But now if we hit save, you can see now the wheel won't physically go past the point where my arms cross. And that should still give me enough range of movement that I can make whatever steering corrections that I need to in the game, catch slides, get out of gravel traps and things like that, but without the risk of a scenario where my arms will cross over and cause an injury. So if I'd had it set like this, there's no way that would have happened in the first place. It wouldn't have stretched to the point where my arms cross and the injury simply wouldn't have happened. So I would definitely recommend, and you will need to fine tune this depending on the type of car that you're driving in the sim as well. Obviously the LMP2 cars are particularly harsh on their force feedback and they do have quite sensitive steering as well. So again, this is what we're talking about with the perfect storm scenario. It twitched around so quickly because it is such a sensitive car in the first place. But in the case of this one, it would have just simply gone to like that, would have gone to there and it would have completely stopped regardless of what the car was doing, regardless of what the sim title was telling the wheelbase to do. It wouldn't have overridden that 360 degree lock-to-lock limitation that we've set there. Now the second thing that I admittedly didn't do is I jumped in the new LMP2 car, and as I was saying before, it is a very sensitive car with very strong force feedback, and I hadn't spent any time fine-tuning my force feedback settings in that car before jumping into a race, and that was part of the reason why it was able to respond so quickly on me as well and didn't give me time to get my hands off, is because I did have the strength up too high for that particular car. So what I would generally suggest is, spend a bit of time getting to know the car and adjusting your force feedback settings in a scenario where you're the only car on track. So use the test mode or a practice session, depending on what sim you're in, simply to get familiar. And the reason I suggest that is because, if you're going to hit a wall or something like that when you're the only car on the road, then you've got plenty of warning. You know that it's imminent. You know it's about to happen, and you can get your hands away very quickly before you injure yourself. Whereas, when you're racing on track with other cars, you don't know what those other cars are going to do. And exactly like we saw in my crash, another car hit me unexpectedly right at the fastest point of the track, and yeah, that was, it was lights out. It was game over for me. So yeah, always fine tune your force feedback settings in a scenario that's a lot more controlled until you've got everything right, and then jump on the track with other cars. So those are the two things I think I could have probably done differently, adjusting my force feedback a little bit differently for that particular car, and having my bump stop range adjusted appropriately so that my arms don't ever cross over in the first place. So before we move on to the more general safety tips, let's just talk a little bit more about how we can actually set our force feedback up a little bit more safely. So what I've talked about a lot in previous videos where we've talked about settings and things like that is dynamic range. Now, dynamic range, as we've explained before, and I'll link in the description below for you guys for some more information on this and some charts and things like that, but dynamic range is the full scale of forces that we have available to us from 0 Newton meters or no force all the way through to whatever the maximum is. So what I generally suggest to people is you want to set your maximum amount of force to the maximum that you ever want to feel. So whether it be crashing into a wall or bumping into another car or something like that. So in most cases, a crash force or something like that when you're hitting a wall is going to be a lot stronger than the forces that you would generally feel when you're, going through corners and over ripple strips and bumps and things like that. So what I like to do, and the way I have my settings set, and we'll go across again quickly here now so you can see. So I have my overall strength here set to about 11.6 Newton meters, which is only about a third or 37% of the strength available on the Simucube 2 Ultimate. Now this is turned down a little bit more than I do for some other cars, because this is a setting that I'm using for the LMP2 car at the moment now, having learned my lesson and gone back in and adjusted it. But yeah, generally I don't go over about 14 Newton meters as a maximum overall strength, and that's including when I hit a wall or something like that. So what I then do is I fine tune my settings inside the game so that I'm using the maximum amount of dynamic range available for steering, and then when I run into a wall or something like that, it'll go into clipping. So we don't worry about clipping when it's in the event of an accident or something like that, because what it's allowing us to do is use that full range of dynamic range that's available to us for driving. So we're getting that full scope of, you know, bumps, ripple strips, rubbing with other cars, bumps and, you know, cornering forces, all those things. But when we get into a crash scenario, we're not pushing past that and all the way up to the 32 Newton meter mark, say for example with the Simucube 2 Ultimate. So the mistake I see a lot of people making is, you know, they'll set their wheelbase to 100% force feedback strength and then fine tune the game a lot lower than that so that they're at a reasonable range when they're driving, because you're not going to be wanting more than sort of, you know, 12, 15 Newton meters of forces when you're going around corners and things like that. But then when they crash, suddenly they get a massive spike in torque all the way up to the 32 Newton meters or whatever the maximum is for their particular wheelbase. And you simply just don't need that massive spike when you're crashing. It's not adding anything to the driving experience. All it's really doing is just increasing the risk of injuring yourself. So adjust it so you're using the maximum amount of dynamic range available as to the point where it's necessary for driving. So up to the point where you want to sort of feel the forces around corners and things like that. And then anything above that, it doesn't really matter if you're going into clipping anyway when you're hitting walls and stuff, because it's not really adding anything to how fast you can go. So let's now have a closer look at some of the other more general tips for safety in sim racing, particularly around direct drive wheelbases. So as I kind of alluded to before, the first thing you want to make sure you're training yourself to do, and this goes for all wheelbases, not only you know, direct drive wheelbase. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of people don't realize, is that even the more mid-level sim racing gear is still strong enough that it can genuinely hurt you, particularly young kids as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But you do want to make sure you're respecting it, because it really isn't a toy. It really is something that can do some serious damage, as I'm sure a lot of you guys will comment in the comments below this video. I know a lot of you have experienced similar sort of injuries to what I did and what Jill has in the past as well. Now, just around general safety as well, always make sure that you're switching off your wheelbase when you're not using it. So it sounds pretty obvious, but there's been a few cases where I've sort of finished a race, I've been angry, and, you know, I've been taken out or something like that, and I've just gone, nah, you know, shut everything down, or so I've thought, shut down the computer and walked away for the night. And there was actually one case where my 3-year-old son got into my studio during the night, and I actually put a padlock on the door now so it can't happen again. But he was in here playing with stuff during the night, and I didn't realize that I'd actually left the wheelbase turned on. And so it would have been very easy for him to, you know, accidentally do something and really hurt himself. These things are strong enough that they will genuinely break your arm if you do something silly. So yeah, just make sure you're switching it off. Switch it off at the wall if you're not using it, but at least, you know, put in the emergency stop button if you have one or something like that. Switch it off when it's not in use. That's going to reduce the risk of, you know, other people being injured by it unexpectedly, as well as, you know, if you're changing wheels or something like that, there's no risk of it suddenly doing something. There have been cases, I've seen plenty of them documented, where, you know, something's gone wrong with the USB interface, or, you know, Windows has gone crazy and suddenly the wheel just starts going crazy. It happened to me when I was doing my SimMagic M10 review about a year ago now. The wheel just went completely crazy on me when I was adjusting some settings, and if I'd had my arm through it or something like that when that was happening, it could have really done some damage. So yeah, if you're not using it, just make sure you do have it switched off or have that e-stop button pressed. Now, as we just mentioned before as well, particularly with GT style wheels, never reach through the wheel, regardless of what you're doing. Even if the wheel is turned off, just don't get yourself in the habit of reaching through the wheel. You can imagine if we had our arm through the wheel and it suddenly started rotating on us out of control, it could really, really, really mess up your arm. And I know since I've installed my little touchscreen dash here that I reviewed a couple of months ago, the temptation has been there to sort of reach through the wheel and make adjustments and stuff like that. Just don't get in the habit of doing that. And the last tip that I have for you guys is, if you do have a wheel that comes with an emergency stop button, please make sure you're mounting it in a sensible location. In my case, I have it just beside my left arm here, right next to my shifter, so I can quickly reach down and hit it if I need to. You know, I've seen a lot of people mount them behind their wheelbase and things like that. Now, if the wheel's going spinning and crazy, the last thing you're going to want to be doing is reaching past the wheel to get to the emergency stop button. So you really want to have it in a location where there's no risk of, you know, having to get your arms or anything close to the wheel to have to reach that button. So my suggestions would be have it somewhere where you can hit it with your foot next to your pedals, for example, maybe next to on the side of your rig where you can hit it with your knee, or next to your shift or something like that. Just don't have it where you're going to have your arms anywhere near an out of control crazy wheel to reach the button, because it pretty much defeats the purpose in the first place. So if you guys have any other tips or suggestions, let us know in the comments below. Let's continue the discussion there. But hopefully this has kind of set some people's minds at ease. I don't think that's, you know, it's something that you need to be scared of, but you certainly do need to respect these things, because, you know, if you don't respect them, they can really hurt you. But if you're sensible with the way you set things up and you do take the time to do things properly, then the risk is minimal. And yeah, by making those few little adjustments that I shared in this video, it 100% would have stopped me from hurting myself the other day. And I just basically got lazy and didn't bother to make those adjustments before I jumped in a new car, and that was ultimately what resulted in me hurting myself. So hopefully this video has helped you guys out. If it has, leave a thumbs up. Make sure you sub to the channel, hit the notification bell too, so you don't miss future ones. And just quickly as well, if you are looking at picking up some sim racing gear, I do have a link down in the description below for you guys, where we do have some discount codes available for a couple of different manufacturers, as well as some affiliate links as well if you guys want to help out with supporting the channel. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.